Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Conversation Corner with Kimberly Douglas. On today's episode, I will be talking about my personal diagnosis story with ADHD. As I mentioned in the first episode, I really felt inspired to talk about this topic because ADHD affects me personally. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 20 years old. I am currently 23 years old, and I've learned so much about myself between now and then, as well as so much about my younger self now that I have the education to understand why I behaved the way I did. ADHD is a topic that is still very taboo in today's society, and it's a topic that is still taboo in communities that I belong to, both the Black community and specifically the Jamaican community. So, my parents are both immigrants from the island of Jamaica. Growing up, we didn't know much about mental health and cognitive health or how those things affected us. And now that I'm a part of a generation that really cares about mental health and gaining the education and wisdom that we missed out on as children, I really think it's important for us to open up these conversations and normalize them more. So, on today's episode, I really want to just go through my personal experience with ADHD, the early signs within my childhood and adolescence, as well as self diagnosis, whether we think that is taboo or valid, and life after diagnosis. So, what I'm doing now to maintain a healthy lifestyle as someone who's neurodivergent. Okay, first, let's start with early signs. To be honest, I don't have many memories from my childhood. I think that could ironically partially be because ADHD affects your working memory. But a lot of the memories I have from childhood revolve in some way around learning. I was either learning through music, learning through shows, fun songs, and ideas and instructions that my parents came up with, little games and things to help us learn. I have two amazing parents who really value education. So growing up, we really were immersed in making sure that we were learning what we needed to know at the ages we were at, as well as the ages we were going to be. Because if you know anything about immigrant parents, they are always making sure that you are ready for the next grade. I think a lot of my early childhood can really be attributed to the type of people I was raised by and the community I was raised in. My parents were very nurturing in making sure that we knew as much as we did, even before entering school. I remember learning how to read and write before going to kindergarten. I always had parents who made sure that they were involved in my education. And I really appreciate that because I think it partially caused me to slip through the cracks a bit as someone with ADHD and be diagnosed later in life. But it also really taught me the importance of education and pursuing an education even before I knew that I was neurodivergent and saw differences in my education. For as long as I can remember, I have been a very different kid. I think everybody's diagnosis story starts the same way when it comes to ADHD. I remember feeling different, seeming different, being in different stages than my peers, and doing things differently than my peers. But I also remember doing things earlier than my peers. I remember picking up a lot of ideas, concepts, and practices much quicker than people my age. I was reading earlier, I was writing earlier, I was understanding certain grammar and concepts quicker than the kids that I was going to school with. And that's not in any way to brag, but I think in a lot of ways, it is important to see that people with ADHD can really pick up concepts fast and seemingly be successful in them, but can still be struggling internally. As someone who grew up with parents from a different generation where mental health and cognitive health were viewed differently and rarely spoken about, to be honest, I'm not super surprised that it took me so long to get an ADHD diagnosis. For a lot of people, honestly, they get diagnosed in childhood. A lot of people have signs and symptoms that are a lot more obvious that get picked up in childhood. However, it's actually quite more common for women, especially, to be diagnosed later in life. There's many women who slip through the cracks of ADHD diagnosis, and there's many women who get misdiagnosed with ADHD, mainly because of the way that we're socialized. As women, versus men, I think we tend to be socialized to handle things a little bit more internally. We are typically taught to be quieter and have things a little bit more together. Not saying that men aren't allowed to do these things or present these ways, but I find that even in media and the way we depict ADHD, we find that a lot of the people who are diagnosed in childhood are young boys because they present more hyperactively, they are more outwardly expressive with their symptoms, and young girls are typically taught to be quieter, more put together, more organized, to sit still, and we tend to handle our symptoms more internally. So personally, I was diagnosed with inattentive type ADHD. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's really important to highlight the family I grew up in, the people who raised me, and the community I was raised in, because that really does play a huge role in who you grow up to be. Your formation is very pivotal in the person that you become, the person you grow into. So I grew up with two parents who are immigrants from Jamaica. So that would make myself and my siblings first generation Canadians, and meaning the first to be born in this country by parents with Jamaican heritage. In Jamaican culture can be very conservative. Jamaican culture is not the most progressive, despite what people might see. Despite what people might think, a lot of topics are still very taboo in Jamaican households, and a lot of Jamaican households are very faith-based. So from my perspective, I grew up in a household that was extremely faith-based. Faith was a really large part of my childhood. My family grew up going to church, and I think that played a large role in just the way that I viewed the world, the way that I handled my problems, and the way that I viewed my own mental health. I think it's also important to talk about the composition of my family. So there's my parents, my two older siblings who are both male, and myself. So it's worth noting that I am not only the youngest of my family, but I'm my parents' only daughter. And being the only daughter, even if you are the youngest daughter, can really be complicated. It can feel very isolating at times, and it can feel like nobody really understands you. Add that to undiagnosed ADHD, and it really felt like no one understood me. And it sucks because my parents and family really are very loving and kind. And I'm really grateful for how progressive my family has been in allowing me to explore more about my mental health and learn more as I got diagnosed. So I got diagnosed with ADHD when I was 20 years old. However, I always tell people that I knew I had ADHD much younger than that. So I would say that I had this really strong feeling that I had ADHD probably since around the age of 11 or 12. By then, I was in sixth grade. Just for context, at the time, I was a musician, a little artist, a creative who was in a regional arts program. So a lot of the kids around me were very eccentric, very expressive, very creative, and probably very neurodiverse. But at the time, we didn't know that. So we just knew what we knew. We knew our music, we knew our dance, we knew our visual arts and our drama. But I didn't realize that the symptoms I was experiencing at that age were actually ADHD. So ever since I was very young, I have been a really creative mind. I started my journey with the arts when I was about 3 years old. At that age, my parents realized that I was really interested in music. And like I mentioned, music was such a large, pivotal part of my childhood. I think if you grow up in any Caribbean household, then music is something that you're hearing all the time, whether at home, on Saturdays when you're cleaning the house, or at a family barbecue. Music was always, always around us, including when we went to church. So being that immersed in music and having parents who really valued education and extracurriculars, my older siblings were both in music lessons at the time. They were both learning piano with the city. And because of that, we had a piano in our home. I would hear it being played and practiced on all the time. And one day, so I've been told, I tinkered with the piano and I started to learn how to play what I was hearing. That's when my parents realized that I had the gift of being able to play by ear. That's when they realized that I was able to mimic what I was hearing through music and sounds. And at the age of 3, they realized that they had a very creative child on their hands. And like many parents, they really thought to nurture it. They wanted to make sure that I had an outlet that made me be as expressive as I could be. But at the time, I was just simply too young to be in music lessons in the city. So, despite not starting at that age specifically, I did end up taking music lessons a few years later, and that kind of became my thing for many years. I'm really, really grateful to my parents for keeping myself and my siblings in extracurriculars. I'm grateful to them for always keeping us on our toes when it comes to our education because honestly, I think it really helped nurture my mind to this day. Even though I didn't get diagnosed at a younger age, I think that having parents who really cared about my education allowed me to get through life with a bit more ease until I figured out what it was that I was really living with. Okay, so back to when I was around 12. In my preteen years, I really started to notice symptoms in myself of me struggling mainly with my focus. It wasn't just that, but it was also my emotions. Everything felt just so overwhelming. And I understand that at that age, there's a lot going on in life. Puberty and changes, both internally, externally, can have a lot of kids from the ages of 11 to 14 feeling very on edge and isolated. However, everything I experienced just felt so heightened. And now, at this age, I'm able to understand that I was dealing with sensory sensitivities. So things like music being too loud, or the tags in my shirt being itchy, or just anything in the room feeling a little too off, either too much or too little, can really trigger people with ADHD. Being someone whose senses are so much more heightened can be pretty exhausting and sometimes pretty upsetting. But to be honest, I think it really just shows how in tune our body is with the environment. And because of that, it's important that we honor our bodies and know when we need space or something else to help. So back to when I was in middle school. When I was in my preteen years, I found that a lot of the symptoms I was experiencing were very in line with anxiety, generalized anxiety. I was experiencing a lot of heart palpitations, a lot of days where I felt very overwhelmed by my environment, a lot of intrusive thoughts, and the occasional panic attack. At the time, I didn't know what that was. I just felt like they were large moments of emotion and felt like it was just so overwhelming that I had to break down. But I found it happening more frequently in school. And it wasn't just when I was alone, it was when I was around students and teachers and in the middle of class sometime. So I remember having to call my dad often to come get me from school. I remember having to step out of class into the washroom and take a second to be away from everyone else. And it was just a lot. Honestly, after a few weeks of the same thing and the reoccurrence of it all, my dad really started to get curious and wonder what it was I was struggling with. I do remember around that age as well being so obsessed with ADHD research. I had just this strong feeling based on what I saw in media and what I already knew briefly about ADHD. And I just felt like the symptoms I knew about were so in line with what I was living and what I was experiencing. So because of that, I found myself going down this huge rabbit hole, learning about what ADHD was like, how it presented in people, and what it was like to live with it firsthand. I also found myself doing research on the biology of ADHD and people who live with it in real life. So many different celebrities and people we know of, authors, musicians, live with ADHD. And those are things that I was learning at that age from doing all this research. I also found myself doing a lot of like online ADHD tests, which sounds kind of funny, but it's not far off for being a first step at diagnosis. So I found myself taking these mini tests, answering questions, and seeing how in line I was with the reality of living with ADHD, the symptoms that I was experiencing. And believe it or not, a lot of those tests came back as someone who is in line with ADHD. But I was still so young. And I remember when I mentioned it briefly to my parents, it wasn't met with the most welcoming response. And it's interesting because having such progressive parents who are quite different than people within their own generation and demographic felt very freeing and very blessed as a kid. But when certain conversations came up, I don't really think my parents knew how to navigate that. And in turn, it kind of came across as dismissing me. So for many years, I didn't really talk about ADHD much. I didn't really talk about living with it, especially with my parents. However, I was talking a lot to my friends and fellow people who may have also been experiencing neurodivergence, and I was just learning as much as I could about it. When I got to high school, I was about 17 years old, going into grade 11. Grade 11 is always kind of regarded as the hardest year of high school, or the year of high school to look out for, because it's the year when you're transitioning from regular courses to college and university courses. It's the year that you're eligible for early acceptance. It's the year that a lot of college students feel like they have to get their life together for the next chapter. When I was in grade 11, I found myself struggling a lot with stress. I found myself struggling a lot with the same symptoms that were repeating from when I was in grade 6. And I really did not appreciate experiencing the heightened levels of anxiety that I was having on a daily basis. So by this time in grade 11, I had already spoken to my parents about my mental health. When I was around 16 years old, I just had a very honest heart-to-heart with them and let them know that I was feeling anxious very often, and that was something that felt like a constant at the time. And because of that, I really just wanted to reach out to some professional help, some resources, and get the treatment that I needed to feel like myself again. I think that sometimes when we experience mental health struggles, and sometimes when we experience neurodivergence that is undiagnosed, it can all just feel very exhausting, very overwhelming, extremely stressful, and like nobody really understands. But being able to have that conversation with my parents, even though conversations did not go the same way or as smoothly before then, it really helps. And this time around, they received it very well. They were really kind, and they actually gave me a lot of resources to turn to. At that age, I decided to go to therapy for the first time, and I started seeing a therapist just about general life. It was a lot of talk therapy, basically about what I was experiencing, the heightened levels of anxiety and stress, how I felt about school, how I felt about my home life, and everything in between. To this day, I do highly recommend therapy for anyone and everyone, regardless of what you're living with or if you're neurotypical yourself, because I think therapy just gives us a level of connection that we all need and deserve as humans. And it allows us to really open up to the deeper parts of our psyche that we don't always explore. I started seeing a therapist around that age, 16 or 17. And originally, my experience went pretty well. It was difficult at first to open up to someone who I didn't know personally, who was around the same age as my parents, and who didn't really know what I was going through. However, I was receptive to it, and it was kind of difficult at first, but eventually I felt more comfortable. At the end of the day, that therapist was not the perfect one for me, and I don't think there really is ever a perfect therapist, but I think I just felt I could be more aligned with someone else. So I tried, and I'm really proud of myself for that. And that was just the first chapter of somebody who would explore therapy more, learn more about herself and her cognitive health, and eventually get a diagnosis. Also, in grade 11 as well, when I was around 17, I unfortunately found myself in the hospital for stress. The same thing was getting to me again and again. And one day I was at school and I was in English class. I remember this. And I just felt a huge wave of anxiety. I felt very overwhelmed and exhausted. I felt very aware of my surroundings and very scared about my future. And I remember one of my best friends was in that class with me, and she knew what was going on with me at the time. So I was just honest with her, and I told her I had to take a step out and take a second because I was having the same issue of heart palpitations, panic attacks, and I just needed a second to breathe. So I remember taking that time away, stepped outside the class for a few minutes, sat down on the ground in the hallway, and I had a panic attack. And at that time, I really just had to look at myself. I had to take in what was going on, and I had to be honest with myself because my friend was so worried about me. My parents were so worried about me. I was worried about myself, but I just thought that there was one mission to complete, which was finishing high school. And at the time, I was willing to push myself through that to make it happen. Now that I'm older, I know that that is not the best way to do things, and that it's much more important to make sure that your mental health is intact so you can show up as the best version of yourself for real life. If it wasn't for my friend being honest with me about the fact that I was having heart palpitations, they were very consistent, and I needed to take better care of myself, I probably never would have taken a serious step back. And believe it or not, despite all of that whole story, we still did not get to the point of really speaking to my doctor about getting a referral and eventually a diagnosis. When I graduated high school, it was 2020, and I graduated during the height of the global pandemic. At the time, classes had already moved fully online. School was completely different than what we ever knew it to be, and I was transitioning to university. I was trying my best to find some sort of normal within that time. I was trying my best to still stay excited about university, despite how much our world's changed. However, I wasn't fully in it, but I really was up for the challenge. I wanted to go to university, and I specifically wanted to go away for university if I got the chance to. I was very blessed and privileged to be able to go away for university and live on campus, so that's what I did. In September of 2020, I moved to London, Ontario to go to Western University, and that is when I started to experience some more of my ADHD symptoms showing up at that point in my life. I find that throughout my life, one constant is that my ADHD symptoms at an undiagnosed stage were very heightened at different points in life when there was some sort of transition. So when I was in grade 6, I was just getting used to middle school. Things were different. I was different. I was growing and changing. And that's when I saw a lot of my worst symptoms come in. Same thing when I was in high school at 16, 17. Things were changing all the time. And because of that, life required a certain level of structure and organization from me that my brain didn't naturally create. Not to say that ADHD brains can't thrive under structure and routine, but because I have a brain that diverges from normal, I have to organize my life in a way that diverges from normal. And unfortunately, a lot of the education system and academic institutions are not conducive to that. So my first few years of university were pretty stressful. Between studying during a global pandemic and trying to find some sense of footing and the transition to a new environment, it was a lot for me. I actually really enjoyed the university environment much more than high school, and high school me had a feeling that that would be the case because high school just felt so boxed in to me. And at that age, I felt like I really knew what was best for me. Don't all teenagers think that? And I really enjoyed a format that allowed me to think a little bit more freely and have some more freedom in the choices I made. So I had a feeling that the way that university was formatted would be better for me. However, I was still lacking the support that I needed to function and perform as best as I could given my circumstances. So when I got to university, first year was kind of rocky. Honestly, all 3 of my years at university were pretty rocky before I took some time off. And mainly, I wanna say that the struggles I had did pertain to studying during a global pandemic. There was just so much going on at the time, and a lot of us really didn't know what to think or expect, and we were really just living life one day at a time. Because of that, I found myself a lot more stressed and worried about certain things, like the state of the world, my personal health, my mental health, and adjusting to a new life away from my family. Now, I would be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy some parts of university. I loved the idea of higher education. I loved being able to choose what I wanted to study and what I was passionate about. And I think that despite everything that I experienced, I really took a lot away from that point in time. When I turned 20, I was in second year by this point. I really got serious about speaking to a doctor about getting a diagnosis. So at the time, I was living away from home, so I didn't have much access to my family doctor in the GTA. However, I made sure to book an appointment with her to speak with her over the phone. In this conversation, I basically had a general update with her, general checkup as in a virtual way, and I brought the idea to her that I believed that I could have ADHD. That was my very first time telling a medical professional and my very first time really reaching out in a big way to get help. When I told my doctor, her response was far from what I was expecting. It was actually a lot more in line with my parents' response to ADHD when I was much younger. It didn't feel very educated, and honestly, it felt kind of discouraging. One of the first things that she asked me was how I did in school as a child. And immediately I knew that the conversation was going to be pretty difficult. The reason I say that is because a lot of people assume that children who do well at young ages in school can't have neurodevelopmental disorders because the child presents well, behaves well, and brings home good grades. A lot of people assume that everything's okay with them. But the reality was a lot of my academic performance as a child was largely due to the fact that my parents were really, really helping me at home. I had to overcompensate for what a lot of my peers got naturally or felt naturally. And I felt like I was doing a lot more work behind the scenes to keep up at school. And once again, I'm really grateful for my parents being such a pivotal part in my education and having all these really cool ways to keep us interested as somebody with an interest-based nervous system. So the conversation with my doctor, it really went in a way that I didn't expect it. But one thing I'll say is that I was very adamant about advocating for myself. I was at a point in life when I just really needed answers. And I was tired of hearing no. And I was tired of hearing that I just needed to work harder or stop being lazy or just buy a planner. If one more person tells me to buy a planner, I think I might explode. It's the worst advice to somebody with a neurodevelopmental disorder. And as much as I laugh at it now, at the time, it really felt very isolating. Hearing my doctor tell me that I basically couldn't have ADHD because I did well as a kid in school. And imagine how upsetting that can feel, how dismissing that can feel. But I was very serious about making sure that I got the help I needed. So I asked her for a second opinion. And at the time, I felt pretty saddened by the way that things went, the way that conversation went. But I also felt really proud of myself for making sure that it didn't just stop there. So when I told her I wanted a second opinion, she believed me. She took my word of advice and she made sure that she got me a referral. Now, we will talk more in the future about how the process of getting an ADHD diagnosis works, but for now, I'll just speak on my process. So from the time that I spoke to my doctor in 2022 to the time I actually got a call from the psychiatrist in the office that helped me with my diagnosis, that period was about 8 months. And for a lot of people, it can look around the same. And a lot of people, it is much longer. So there's so much that we can speak on about the medical system in Canada and how difficult it can be to get an ADHD diagnosis for people like me. So at the time, obviously life went on and I just had to keep studying and doing what I had to do. By this point, I was self-diagnosed. I had known enough about myself, my body, my brain, and about ADHD to not completely decide matter of factly that I was living with ADHD, but to decide that I at least knew that I had something different and that that I had to behave differently because I was living with something different. I remember finally getting that call from the mental health office that was going to help me with my diagnosis and realizing that after 8 months, the referral came in handy. I remember where I was, I remember what I was doing, and I kind of just stopped everything to realize that this was really happening. I spoke to the people from the mental health clinic and we had a great conversation about what it was that I wanted to find out. We also had a good conversation about immediately planning an appointment for me. And at the time, it still felt so far away because the appointment was about 3 months after that. When the time came, I was already in third year. This had been almost a whole year and some change passed. And it was time for me to get my appointment. When the time came for me to have my appointment, I got a whole bunch of information on a bunch of forms that I had to fill out and things I had to do before the actual test day. So at the time, I had to fill out a few forms about my own information, general medical information and history, as well as ask a parent and a really close friend to fill out a paper for me that highlighted symptoms that they saw in me. So basically, based on the DSM-5, to be diagnosed with ADHD, you have to be exhibiting at least 6 to 9 of the listed symptoms in the DSM-5. When I was much younger, I definitely saw my hyperactive symptoms more prominent as I was a kid who was so talkative and always had something on my mind, and I was always energetic, running around, and kind of exhibiting more of those motor-like symptoms of somebody with hyperactive type. By the time I got to my teen years and preteen years, I really saw myself calm down a lot more in the sense that a lot of my symptoms became internal and I was experiencing a lot more restlessness and things that happened inside as opposed to externally. At the time, I asked one of my parents and my best friend to fill out those forms for me for the doctor. And they did the best they could to check off the symptoms that they saw me present and express when I was with them. Now, these were two people who really knew me well for that time of my life and who could definitely speak to what it was that I was doing and how I was behaving at the time. So when all of our forms were filled out, I got all my information back to the mental health clinic, back to the psychiatrist, and we started the process of actual testing. I remember coming home for a weekend and going to the test center with my parents because I really wanted to involve them in the entire process. I felt that if I could get the answers I needed, they could also get some answers and learn a lot as well. So we went to the testing center, and on my test day, I remember feeling pretty good. I wasn't super nervous, but I was in the headspace of being kind of angsty, a little restless, knowing that on the other end of this, I was going to get answers that I had wanted for the larger part of my life, but still feeling like I didn't really know much. So I wanted to have an open mind and make sure that I was going into it feeling as level-headed and ready as possible. And honestly, I think the day went pretty well. We got to meet the psychiatrist. My parents both got to speak to him and learn a little bit more about what it was I was experiencing and how they were going to test for it. When the actual test came, it was pretty simple. There were many elements that tested my working memory, my concentration, all of the executive functions that we live with as humans. And they were all formatted kind of in the sense of games or puzzles. So it kind of just felt like a few hours of me taking a bunch of quizzes, doing some puzzles, playing some games, and they were all testing my cognitive ability. By the end of the day, we got sent off and we basically just prepared to hear back with results. When my result day came around, I had a meeting with myself, my parents, and the psychiatrist to talk about the results. Essentially, he came to the conclusion that I was living with ADHD, the inattentive type, and he gave us a whole presentation, a rundown of what that meant, what my test scores were, which percentile I was sitting in based on my responses, and how this would affect me going forward. He gave us treatment options. He gave us so many resources just to set me up for the next chapters of my life now that I knew that I was living with ADHD. In general, I feel like that process went pretty well. It went as great as I could have imagined because I had my parents with me and I felt like I was really getting the validation I needed to understand more about myself. After diagnosis, there were still a lot of questions that were unanswered. It honestly felt like a grieving process. It felt like I had to come to terms with the fact that I was living with something that hadn't been validated up until this point, but was very real to me. So just like every stage of grief, I felt myself feeling the anger, the sadness, the denial, everything in between, because it was like I was grieving the part of myself that was undiagnosed and welcoming the new part of myself that knew that I was diagnosed, that knew that I had the validation of what I was living with, and now had to maneuver and shape my life to adapt to someone who thinks in a way that's always been different. And honestly, it opened my eyes to so much. It opened my eyes to the fact that we live in a world that is catered to neurotypical people. And the reason that life is so hard as a neurodivergent person is not essentially because I'm neurodivergent, but because the world around me doesn't really cater to people with brains like mine. The education system, the job force, everywhere you look, it's much harder to navigate this world when your brain diverges from the normal. I think another process that was really pivotal to my growth and navigating life, even up until now as a student, was my process with the accessible education department of my school. So for those of you who don't know, accessible education is a department that should be at every school, every academic institution. And basically, they're the department that takes care of accessibility, students with disabilities, and any accommodations that you may need based on your circumstances. When I found out that I had ADHD, it was in November of 2023. This was 2 months into a new school year, and I was told that I couldn't apply for accessible education or be eligible for my accommodations in the middle of a semester. So even though school had just started a few weeks earlier, about a month and a half earlier, I had to wait until second semester to be eligible for accessible education. And that was pretty upsetting. Even though accessible education is not perfect and it still has a lot of evolution to go, I really do think that it's so necessary as a starting point for people with neurodivergence and people with different abilities to feel like they can learn in the same spaces as neurotypicals. It can be very isolating sometimes, being in the same classroom as people who think in a way that's quote unquote normal, but knowing that you don't, and trying to learn on the same level. And often I find that in the education system, we don't use a diverse array of learning styles. If you're a visual learner or a bodily kinesthetic learner who learns better with tactile examples or working with their hands, you need to have those examples in every way, in everything that you learn. When you learn, you got to try and learn in your learning style. Otherwise, it can make a topic that's so simple become so complex and confusing. But I find that a lot of the system that we use today doesn't really support more creative and diverse learners because everything is kind of expressed in the same way, either in written format or in a lecture style. And that's just not how everybody processes information. So I think there's a lot that is being done currently at the post-secondary level, at the elementary level, at the high school level, and I really commend that. But I think there's a lot of room for growth, and a lot of it stems from, once again, just listening to people from these communities, understanding what we need, and adapting to that as the world changes. This has been a really long journey and a really long time coming, from being a really creative child to somebody who really struggled in school despite never really having that problem, to now being someone who understands her brain, her cognitive health, and really advocates for it every day. I am constantly growing and evolving and learning more about myself and my brain, and I think it's important that we all do as well. So thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope that it has informed you and inspired you. I hope it's made you feel something, even if it just made you laugh. But in general, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next one. This podcast was created for education and entertainment purposes only. All included content is 100% the personal opinions, experiences, and research of Kimberly Douglas. Thank you for tuning into Conversation Corner with Kimberly Douglas. Until next time, stay educated, think critically, and question everything.